And we are live, and I've been looking forward to this one. What makes a good analyst? What makes a bad analyst? And why the heck did my special guest turn his back on the profession?
Wow.
Welcome, Hyoun Park. How are you doing?
Doing good. How are you, John?
Oh, we had a little trouble scheduling this because everything's going on. I mean, it's a crazy week with HubSpot and everything. Uh, if you're watching this, feel free to comment in the chat. If you got invited to this, I handpicked those. There's nothing AI related there. That's you got handpicked to be here. So please chime in if you're watching, so I know the stream is working. If you have any problems, let me know. So, I'm not a real nostalgic, sentimental person when it comes to the enterprise, but I felt when you announced that, Hein, that you were no longer going to be an industry analyst, which you did, was a couple months ago now,
Oh,
something like that.
back in
Um,
April.
Back in April, yeah. That hit me a little bit hard because, well, frankly, I thought you were such a good analyst, and I know that you wouldn't have taken that decision lightly. And so the fact that you were going to shift gears and pursue an AI related opportunity, I really want to get into sort of why you made that decision. So we will go there and we'll talk about your new company, Levelpath, and what you're trying to do there.
Sure.
But I kind of wanted to, and by the way, folks, I know there's a lot to talk about with the impact of quote unquote AI on the analyst industry. When Gartner's stock goes down almost 50%, that's going to get certain LinkedIn gurus talking about the death of the analyst profession and all of that. So we're going to go there too. Uh, so I just wanted to let y'all know, in case you get a little bit impatient, we are going to get to this whole AI thing, but there's something a little more fundamental I wanted to start with, around this, which is just really kind of what makes a good analyst, and one of the reasons why and you first came on my radar was the classic reason, which is I'd go to events and you'd ask a question of executives in our like group meetings, and I came to really look forward to those questions. And I was like, this is someone who knows how to press the issues in a really interesting way. So I'd like to just pay tribute to the fact that you were just great to have on the circuit, and we're going to miss you. And not only I think you're one of the sharpest minds I've run into, in my opinion, but I also, just to be frank, I think you just a really kind, good person. And I just really enjoyed seeing how you treated people, because you were never someone who was like, I'm brilliant, so I'm going to be difficult. Like I saw on many occasions that you would step in and try to help people. Events can be hard and chaotic. You always seem to keep your head about you. And so I don't want to have an elaborate tribute session for you because you're not really going away. But I just wanted to acknowledge this transition, that you made a difference in people's lives in your current role. And I want to thank you for that. So thanks for being here today.
John, thanks so much. You could talk about me like that for another hour if you like. I mean, it sounds amazing. But I really enjoyed my time as an industry analyst. And, I think the challenge was always trying to balance, you're trying to have executive access. You're also trying to help end users with very practical concerns on how to buy software and look at the market at large from a technology perspective and figure out what are buzzwords versus what is reality that is going to change your approach. And honestly, those changes don't happen every month or every 3 months as much as everybody in the product marketing and software marketing worlds would like to think so. And of course, now that I'm on the vendor side, I might be able to, I might conflict that in a few months. We'll see. But I'm not going anywhere. Like in my background right here, this is downtown San Francisco where I'm working, and I'm sure I'll be able to meet up with a bunch of you over the next few months.
Indeed, you just had your first briefing, you told me, with IDC, where you were on the other side of the table. So we're going to get to that too. But can you just share a little bit about what is your sort of secret sauce? Like, put your analyst hat back on again. How do you try to carry yourself in terms of making a difference in the lives of customers and vendors? What do you think was important to how you did your job?
Yeah, so it is a multifaceted job, I feel like, to do the industry analyst job well. We are in the analyst space tasked to be kind of the conscience of our markets as well as drivers of our markets. So I feel like It's important to have awareness, have people know who you are and that they can go to you as a resource for the market or the areas that you are best known for. If you're talking about, say, AI ethics or something, wherever it is, you have to have that awareness. And you have to have people working with you and being able to reach out to you. That's a piece of the puzzle at this point. I think reach is important in terms of being able to go out to the audience that you are trying to work with. I think influence matters in that you have to figure out to what extent can you actually affect people's opinions and mindsets and perspectives uh, associated with your topic. And then how much can you provide directional guidance to the market at large and actually perhaps change things as they are needed. So, just a very basic example. Right now, I've joined a procurement startup. Obviously, the procurement world has been slow moving for a really long time. So we are, selfishly looking for analysts who are willing to talk about the future of procurement and aren't just talking about how buy RFPs worked in 1996.
Absolutely. You're getting some congrats in the chat.
Oh,
Um,
thanks, y'all.
Josh, nice to see you because I know you have a pending meeting, but I really want to front load this topic because I know, Josh, you have some strong feelings about being an industry analyst in the face of your AI critiques. Uh, so just to be clear, Hein, you did not leave this profession because you perceive it as dying or going extinct then, eh?
No, from a very tactical perspective, I was turning down deals in June and July as I was finishing up my job search. For the business, I feel is there, especially for analysts who are making real impact and have built an audience and are known for being able to provide help and guidance. I think that is right there. I think the hardest part right now in this analyst world is trying to show that value and the reach actually exists. So I think to some extent that uh, leads vendors to perhaps work just with Gartner or just with firm of choice, the known quantities, and there's some challenges in figuring out how to actually articulate your value proposition if you're not Gartner.
Indeed. I've always looked at that like I've got to work 3 times harder and try to deliver 5 times the value or whatever, which I take as a
Right.
healthy challenge, but I totally hear you, and I think the algorithm's working against us, frankly, a little bit. The changes to the LinkedIn algorithm have intentionally taken a big chunk of the platform away from independence, and that's a different story, but it pertains to your thing around demonstrating reach. Um, I happen to think that there's a lot of I teased this in the show. I called it bad industry analysts, and that's just let's be face it. That's just me being a little bit viral. I'm not going to go around and saying there's bad industry analysts, but I will say that a lot of analysts disappoint me in how they do things. I'm looking for people that are really looking to advocate for customers and really speaking up in front of vendors to challenge them on the direction. But what do you think? Like, what when you went to these events, what were you saying? Oh, this is some of the best analysts, or maybe these are some characteristics that I don't like so much.
Yeah, I will try to stay positive, at least to start with, and say that the analysts I enjoy the most are the ones who have their pulse on customer bases and how they are trying to buy something in the here and now, and those that are willing to ask pointed questions, but pointed questions based on that perspective. I don't think that simply walloping an executive on the side of the head and saying,
Right.
"Why are you so immoral as a company?" Like that's just kind of a broad swipe, and it
Kind
doesn't
of a
really
grandstanding feeling. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And then it just makes everybody defensive. Whereas there could be more pointed questions around why multi-tenant versus single tenant, or why don't you have this particular governance capability, or when are you going to this geography. There are things that are specific to actually being useful to both large enterprises looking for software as well as this increasing focus on the mid market that have enterprise complexity, but one person to do the job who need help as well, and being able to provide that perspective and serving as a bridge between those, call it, customers who are underserved and executives who might only be able to hear from you. Because, John, you and I know, we might get to see, say, Mark Benioff answering our questions a couple times a year, whereas the average Salesforce customer might not have that opportunity. So we get to be that bridge, right?
Yeah, exactly. I really like it when analysts embrace the role of not having exclusive meetings, but serving as a conduit. And one of the better things about our profession is unshackling a little more of the NDAs and being able to share more with your constituents. And I would always look out for your blog post because occasionally you would put out a really meaty blog post, and I recommend folks check out your blog to kind of get a handle on issues. And I love that idea of reflecting back into communities. By the way, Tracy, I just want to give you a call out. I haven't seen you in a while, but it's always great to have you in my show. Thank you. Josh put out a comment here proving value. Too many of the models for tracking influence are geared towards measuring what AR pros know how to measure, and that leaves out the kind of input the independents have that don't fit into those models. I wrote about this in my Next Gen Analyst Relations series because part of what I make the argument for is that to have better analyst relations, you need to measure different things. And the things that you need to measure are sometimes a little harder, right? Like how do you measure when someone like yourself pulls an executive aside after a briefing and says, "Hey, your customers are telling me that this isn't working well," or "Here's a real big flaw in your AI strategy I didn't want to share, with publicly, but here's something." Like, how do you put a value on that, right? But I've seen so many times, right, that can have a material impact on a company's direction.
Yeah. And although those are valuable, I think, to some extent, analysts struggle with how to position that correctly, other than to say, yes, what I say is really important because I'm very smart, and not
Mhm.
being able to take the next step and say, here is an example of where the market or the vendor was beforehand. We had a discussion. I can't always provide you with the details, but afterwards, we definitely saw progress towards this direction that led to something over the next year or two. And being able to have that kind of structure and the before and after, I think is an important, just tactical value proposition from the analyst perspective. And I think vendors want proof points that say this analyst is influential, but simply saying I'm so smart is not the same thing as proving that you're influential.
One thing I've noticed, I don't know if you picked up on this also, but a little bit of a feeling sometimes of aging out of our profession. Like a lot of the analysts I look to
Mm.
seem a little bit older. Now, I do run into some smart young analysts at some of the bigger firms, and I'm kind of hopeful that eventually they'll break out on their own or whatever and kind of like do their own thing a little more. But if you were kind of a young aspiring person who was drawn to this profession, and let's face it, it's you can make a good living, but it's not the most lucrative jobs you can get in our industry. There's much more lucrative gigs. What would you say is the real appeal and importance of this, and how would you counsel a younger person that wanted to become a good industry analyst?
So I feel like I was in that situation when I started as an industry analyst. I was in my early 30s, um, working from an IT career and trying to figure out what was next from a business perspective. And the big appeals of this job for me at the time, which I think are still pretty relevant now, are that as an industry analyst, I got to talk to hundreds of companies a year and figure out how they are marketing, how they are positioning, how they are setting themselves up for the next 6 to 12 months, and being able to do a lot of comparative research on how the software world was being shaped. And that's a powerful position to be able to get that kind of education and frankly be paid for it. I
Mm.
think that's great. But I also think that there's a really interesting opportunity to be able to help shape and position a market at a relatively young age, especially if you choose a smaller niche market that may not have high mainstream attention. It's very hard for, say, a 26-year-old to come in and change the AI market. That is frankly probably not going to happen at the analyst level. But if you do get something nichier, like AI for a specific vertical or finance for a specific vertical, like there are a lot of changes you can make. When I started, I focused a lot on the what's called the telecom expense management space, specifically paying off telecom bills and managing cost optimization. And it was a $1 billion market, with the number of market players that had venture capital funding. And I was able to make a significant difference as a young analyst in that space because there was a lot of room to be able to shift that. And then being able to use those lessons as I moved into larger markets ended up being really valuable as well. And being able to talk to those CEOs like day after day, month after month was a fantastic education as well. Even as I was covering that market and providing guidance to buyers on what to look for next and where each vendor was improving or changing their focus over time.
One thing I've also noticed about your work, and I don't see this that often, but I've tried to you kind of inspired me a bit along these lines, is I refer to it sometimes as the paradox of AI leadership, but I think it applies to analysts also, which is I sympathize and believe in this sort of outcome-based ability to kind of create business narratives that make sense to business decision makers. But I also think understanding the technology under the hood is really important. And I had some arguments with some HR leaders about this spring because they were saying AI is a lot like an iPhone. I just need to know how to use it. And I said that's not at all the case because you're going to be accountable for the decisions that a AI makes, including especially if you use it in more risky areas like recruitment or screening, candidate screening, or succession planning, or performance, or whatever. You need to be able to explain that technology and understand why you're using it. And I think you're someone who's always, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've always taken that seriously, that you need to understand the tech, but also be able to bridge that business gap and explain why it matters in business terms.
Yes, absolutely. I was a database administrator before I came into the industry analyst world. And so I'm always biased towards thinking that the data is important and understanding workflows and lineage and having that work transparency is important. But I think it's especially true now in the time of AI when we are trying to figure out what exactly happened from a transformation perspective or from a guidance perspective, from a prompting perspective, from a generative perspective to create this advice. Which data did you use as your context and how did you build your instructions? Where are you building your custom prompts? You have to speak this language, at least at the technical level, because you have to show lineage to the extent possible. So there is always going to be a part of AI that is a little black boxy just because of the millions of iterations that you sometimes go through to get to an answer. But at least at some level, you can provide guidance on saying, well, when we did those million iterations, we were going through basically asking the question of this over and over again. And you can at least explain what's happening there. But we're using AI across the board for basic productivity, talent acquisition screens, to talk about an HR example, things like that. And you can't just say the AI took care of it without having a good idea of how the AI was involved. I think it's massively important to understand the data, the workflows, the AI approach, the retrieval augmented generation, the agent to agent discussions, what is being changed together. If you can't explain that, then you're essentially selling magic and having your customer just hope that just trust you. I don't think that's a good approach without earning trust.
Right. And I want to get into this AI part, but I did, say what makes a bad analyst in my title. So I want to just briefly get into sort of that aspect
Okay.
and in terms of like pitfalls to avoid really. And let me just give you a couple of mine and you can see what you have. Like on this AI thing was interesting because I was at an AI related analyst briefing and I saw one of the analysts say, "What is RAG?" And at this point, I felt like if you don't know what RAG is, why are you an AI analyst? Like, why are you even here? Like, I don't mean to sound like an asshole. It's just that, like, it, my concern is that if you don't understand stuff like that, you're going to fall into this magical thinking about this technology instead of understanding how it gets the results that it does and also what its limitations are. So that's one of my beefs. But I think my bigger beef is just stop it with all the vendor driven narratives. I know that vendors pay a lot of bills in our industry, and frankly, vendors pay most of my bills. And I do have to report on vendors. I'll be at Workday Rising shortly, and I'll be producing a lot of Workday content. But I'm drawn to people, I don't know about you, that have their own unshakable research, passion, and agenda. And yes, they cover vendors and they have things they care about, but they're driven by something deeper than that. And a lot of times, as Josh and I were discussing a couple days ago offline, it's driven by a passion for customer success and
Mhm.
delivering more for customers. And I feel like that's where analysts, especially younger analysts, could get off track and kind of get caught up in the vendor, what I call spoon feeding of narrative, instead of driving your own narratives on what matters to customers. What do you think? Are you similar to that? Are you different or?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it is very tempting. And I'm not just going to say for young analysts, but for analysts to chase the money and chase the story that will get them the largest contracts rather than the ones that drive long term success and reputation. And the problem is, if you do that too often, you stop being an analyst in anything but name, and you become, call it a PR consultant, call it a messaging amplifier or an influencer. But
Influencer, yes,
uh-huh,
indeed, yes.
yes, but you stop being an analyst at that point. And I do think there's a little bit of a problem right now in this market that, in the industry analyst market, that you have people who are really influencers or messengers who are calling themselves analysts and then getting invited to analyst based events and kind of throwing stuff off kilter compared to the actual job of the analyst in, uh, frankly, helping with six figure and seven figures software decisions. Like that's kind of the actual kind of concrete goal that kind of pays the bills from the customer side. Um, you can have smaller deals, of course, and the most important thing is to help the customers and help end users with what they're doing. But I do think there's this problem that we are sometimes uh, mismatched in terms of the people who are in the analyst room versus what the actual analyst job is that is meaningful for the market at large.
Yeah, and I would also say that if you're gonna do things in what I perceive as the quote unquote right way for yourself in this analyst industry, you are sometimes gonna leave money on the table. That's just a fact. But I would say, well, why are you an analyst in the first place? Because there's bigger money in this industry.
Yeah.
So if you want to go this road, you'll make a good living by sticking to your guns. And I think Josh reinforces what you're saying, talking about earning trust is a key issue, the trust of vendors, customers, and peers. And I think to your point, if you stick with that in the long run, there is a good living to be made there. It's just a different type of approach to monetization, I think, than cashing in early, you know?
Yeah, and I think there are multiple roads to be there. You can become a strong analyst at a large firm, which does pay
Yep.
pretty well, or you can go independent. And if you can run your own business and some sort of revenue stream, or work with a partner or two who are strong in that department, there's also a fair amount of money on that side of the table as well. You don't have to be a starving analyst.
Indeed, we have a comment around the voice of the customer is a good analyst. I think that could be one strong definition. Tracy's talking about following the money. It's hard with analysts. With consultants, you can check if they're trying to sell you software, conflicts of interest. Tracy, yeah, this is a good one. And I've actually had a couple long shows where we got into things like disclosure and transparency. And I think we could all benefit from that, both from the bigger firms and the smaller firms and independents around. People like to know how you're getting paid because everyone's getting paid, right? And I criticize a lot of vendors that pay my bills, but one of the things we do is we disclose on every blog post who our clients are so that people know that and they can take that with a grain of salt and decide. There's pros and cons, right? Because obviously you're getting paid by someone that can affect your commentary, but at the same time, your close relationship with that vendor can also yield insights. So the way we like to think about it is let the reader decide. Let's disclose how we're getting paid, and let the audience decide where the value comes from. So I want to shift a little bit into the AI part of this and talk about AI and analysts, and then I want to get into AI and your new venture.
Sure.
So one thing I want to start with AI was your advice before for young professionals, because I'm on the warpath for a few misconceptions that I perceive around this technology, and one of them is that domain experts are no longer needed, and I'm making the argument that the opposite is true, because the reason this domain expertise thing happened is because of folks like Sam Altman, let's just pick him for one, who have
Mhm.
said things like, "This is your PhD in a box." You know, it passes all these advanced exams, like it's an expert in every field or whatever. And obviously, we know about the jagged intelligence problems and the hallucinations, but I'm going to make the argument that domain experts are going to be needed more than ever, because sometimes they're the only ones that can see where the output from these systems is flawed in that domain, right? And so my argument is d- to young people is double down on your domain expertise, because that's going to be the best way you can kind of smell when things are going wrong with your models. What is your take?
Yeah. So, first of all, I don't think that simply having a PhD assistant in AI solves the problem because, for instance, I look at those math problems that the AIs are solving. I don't even understand those math problems. So, how am I supposed to evaluate something if I don't even understand the basics of what that analysis is? Like, yes, AI is definitely able to have superhuman intelligence in specific domain areas. I have no doubt about that. Frankly, my spreadsheet was able to outmath me. Has always been able to outmath me throughout my entire life. Ever since Dan Bricklin invented it, like that, that's not even a question. But just because a computer can provide a superhuman capability does not mean we don't have to have subject matter knowledge or basic knowledge at that going forward. It just means that we have access to additional analysis that can help us with our own decision making process. So I think that's an important initial point because the second part is the idea of a PhD level assistant. Yeah. So if you know actual PhDs, you know that what makes them PhDs isn't that they have an encyclopedic knowledge of their topic at hand. A PhD in history does not know everything about history. PhD in biology does not know everything about biology. What they're good at is multi-year structured research that has led to this gigantic 500-page thesis, making them the world's leading expert in a specific topic. And I really haven't seen any evidence that LLMs are able to do that kind of work in detail. So I think the PhD label is a misnomer at this point, and we get stuck in using the wrong words to describe what are impressive and superhuman capabilities.
And I would argue also that if you're a PhD in that field, like you said, of biology, and you see some output that is a little bit deviated from your core domain, you likely have a network of expert practitioners as well in that domain. So you can also contact those people and do sense tests on that information as well. So I think part of domain expertise is not in isolation, but it's all the relationships you build up around that. That is a magnificent BS detector and way of assessing things. And I think Tracy makes a really important point here. She says, but it is shiny. This is why AI can be so terrifying. People are just believing whatever it says is correct or accurate.
Yes, and there definitely has to be grounding associated with the AI. You can't just take it for granted.
Indeed. Let's see. Yeah, the complexity to business life is sometimes hard to capture in these tools as well.
Mm.
So I think that's an interesting starting point. I don't want to spend a ton of time on the future of the analyst industry, but I do think we should touch on that because, of course, we saw gurus on LinkedIn declaring the death of the analyst profession, using these shocking charts of Gartner in particular as kind of the poster child of a declining stock price, going down closer to 50, I think 6% of its high. I actually, in last week's Hits and Misses, I did some commentary riffing on Brian Summers' article on sort of, which was more about services industry in general, but he also included stuff on research. Let's focus a little bit on the research side and on the future of analyst relations. what would be your take on AI's level of threat to the analyst industry?
I think it is a threat in that it is a transformative tool. Um, so when I started as an industry analyst 17 years ago, my job was to send out surveys to a specific base of respondents, analyze the 300 responses I would get every quarter, and turn it into a 30 to 40 page benchmark report. That market is practically dead as a meaningful analyst job at this point. But that's not really a problem because there ended up being other ways to provide guidance and to find information that led to a combination of arbitrage and kind of assimilation and summarization. So it's a matter of being able to figure out what is the best way to summarize information and then being able to provide that out to the audience and to the world at large. And I actually think that AI, like specifically generative AI, LLMs, the new stuff, the confusing stuff, the potentially wrong stuff is actually an interesting tool in that we can use custom prompts, we can train LLMs on our public writings and our perspectives and then provide a virtual version of ourselves that can provide guidance going forward. That's potentially monetizable, or it's at least scalable to answer journalist questions when it's the middle of the night. There's a bunch of different potential tools to be able to use a tool to be able to use AI like that to be able to further scale ourselves. We're still very much in the early days of figuring out how to do it. This is everything in AI. I feel is still pre 2000 internet from my view. Like we're still trying to figure out how this works. We still have these blinky HTML tags. We have all these rainbow colored sparkle stuff that on corporate sites that just doesn't make any sense. That's the equivalent of how I feel a lot of AI is in the corporate world right now. We are still just starting to figure out how to really make AI work from a practical perspective.
Yeah, one of my takes on this was, well, first I talked about how, look, I mean, there's something about getting stuff on demand that can be very seductive, right? And, you know, I have felt for a long time there's been a vulnerability in services industries that just haven't been disrupted nearly as much as software has with SaaS and various kinds of, microservices. Like software's been heavily disrupted, much less so services. And I think research qualifies. And I felt like the static report culture was legacy for a long time. And AI really demolishes that. But at the same time, I wanted to make some points there, which is that just because research is fast doesn't mean it's beautifully accurate at all times
Hmm.
through these systems. And not everything that you would want in research is in the public domain and in these systems. And I think it's really important to think about some of those things that, yeah, I welcome the challenge of not being so static, right? Because this idea of like hanging on your past knowledge, I don't think that was really very useful to how fast the world is moving anyway. So, but I would caution against people who think that analysts are going away, but I think it poses some really good challenges. I don't know about you, because what I talked about is is the importance of things like original thinking, and the more you evolve, these tools don't evolve, I don't think, as fast as someone
Right.
like yourself, like where you can come up with an original premise and put it out there and then help customers solve problems. To me, that stuff doesn't AI doesn't touch that. So if going back to our analyst conversation, if you're doing those kinds of things, I don't see how AI can replace that.
Yeah, I think AI does a great job of reflecting publicly available historical perspectives. And it can, like, if I want to figure out did Steve Jobs sound like from a public perspective and write a, I don't know, post or speech that reflects those characteristics, there's a lot of historical data to be able to show that. But if I want to say, what is the most convincing way to discuss something in 2025? LLMs aren't going to be able to help you with that. They barely have the content. A lot of the best speeches from 2025 aren't public. All sorts of reasons that you're going to want to work with an expert for something like that. And I think the analyst world is similar. That when you're talking about timely prompts and timely discussions about how the world works in 2025, so much of that is still under wraps or simply in discussions that aren't being broadcast very widely, it's very difficult to get that information directly from an LLM. LLMs can provide some guidance on outward facing messaging, absolutely. But as for what is happening internally or from a process perspective to get from here to there, there's still a lot that is hidden in the enterprise software buying process.
This is a fascinating question. Can AI state where a specific market should go next as an analyst does?
I think it can say where a market would have gone next based on an analyst's prior thoughts. Like if you wanted to get my thoughts from 10 years ago on where a market should go next, I think AI might be able to help with that. But I think for timely responses, unless an analyst is actively tuning a model to their own perspectives, I think it would be hard for an AI to provide timely specific market guidance at this point. You can get a general view. You can probably get an, I don't know, Accenture like view that is
Right.
based on a model or a history rather than a specific perspective or specific personal perspective.
Yeah. Thomas has a good one. Hi, Thomas. Glad to see you in the chat as always. Another big threat is that some companies think they can replace candid conversation with clients done by analysts with LLM research. And I'll just add to that. I think one interesting thing we may see a little bit of is a little bit of a backlash effect, like we sometimes see in the job market, where you see a bunch of supposed AI layoffs, and then some people are rehired as you kind of get a better handle on what the systems can and can't do. I could see a little bit of this happening in terms of LLM interactions where, yeah, I can do this and I'm going to cut my analyst budget way down. And then realizing that you really miss some of the kinds of conversations you were able to have with human analysts. So I could see a little bit of that dynamic.
hmm Yeah.
So, go ahead, say more.
No. I'm good.
Akshara, hey, nice to see you. By the way, I think you may be anonymized in my version of the chat, but glad you're here. Uh, Speaking of a great analyst at a big analyst firm, uh, welcome, Akshar. So, so let's shift gears a little bit and move closer to Levelpath. I wanted to ask you first. You put out a landmark post, what I consider a landmark on generative AI. Was it almost 3 years ago? The instant mediocrity post, two and a half.
Instant mediocrity, yes.
Yeah, and I thought instant mediocrity was really interesting because when you read the piece, you weren't necessarily saying that was a bad thing, right? You were kind of trying to help people to understand that sometimes being able to do things at a big scale, even if it's not at a super high level of excellence, can still be really powerful, right?
Yeah.
Customer support is, I think, a really interesting example. We've also seen that in coding too, where being able to generate a lot of this stuff, even if it's not brilliant, can still sometimes be very effective. Have your views evolved since that post, and to what extent?
Um, I think at this point, instant mediocrity is a little bit of a misnomer, only because there is LLMs have gotten smarter in certain instances, like we've talked about with math or science or fact-based work. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of interesting capabilities that are there that can be accessed. Things like Claude Code exist where Claude Code isn't going to write your entire app for you, but for 25 or 50 line snippets for an applet or to create basic functionality, yeah, it'll do that just fine. And now, so it's changed our work patterns to be able to say, we can get this paragraph or this snippet that is topically good. And then we have to put these things together in a way that make broader logical sense in a way that an LLM is not well designed to support. And I think that's fine. Like, I don't need to describe every single aspect of what makes a relational database when an LLM can handle that specific detail for me. So I can go into greater detail on describing, okay, so how is a data lake different, or how are these different data mart approaches going to fit into that enterprise database perspective or not? Just a very specific example, but saying, so I'm going to use the LLM as that foundational background for something that it's very well suited to do, so I can dig in and do the deeper analysis. To some extent, that's still mediocrity, but you have to understand where the scale is for mediocrity.
Indeed. I just want to put a ribbon on our past conversation because I think Tracy summed it up well here. She has a hard time believing that a CHRO is going to make spend decisions based on an AI agent. They really should have made that decision from talking to one analyst. The reputation is on the line. A couple analyst peers, really smart people in separate conversations, and then compile and decide. And Tracy, I believe that should still be the case, but it's also, I think, going to be the case more and more that a so-called agent or LLM could be part of the voices in that conversation. And I think we'll get to that in the context of procurement here in a couple of minutes. But I did want to say also, and that I think one other interesting thing around the instant mediocrity is when you wrote that post, that was at a time where we were really assessing LLMs as sort of like their own entity. Whereas in the enterprise architectures of today, LLMs, I would say, are more what I would call a constrained technology that are put into context with other kinds of systems that help to compensate for their weaknesses. And so when we look at things like context intelligence, where you're helping LLMs imperfectly, but still you're providing them with guidance, right? You're
Mhm.
giving them very specific documentation in specific areas. You're giving them access to tools that can sometimes verify their decisions. That I think changes things a little bit in terms of how these architectures work. I don't consider them truly cognitive systems, but they're it's an advancement upon the kind of raw architectures that you were analyzing in that post,
Yes.
which I think brings us a little bit to your decision to join Levelpath because, you know, I one of the I think most promising use cases around AI in the enterprise is around things that you might call document intelligence, helping humans that are overwhelmed with documents make better sense of those documents and make better decisions. And since Tracy brought up this notion of spend decisions, let's get into that. Like you basically chose to make this leap based on this technology. So why did you do this and why did you choose Levelpath?
Yeah. So starting at the highest level, I saw that AI was fundamentally changing the way that software was functioning. And it was a change that reminded me of the mobile revolution as well as the internet revolutions. And I was not part of the product process really for either of those. And I thought this was an opportunity to get into that decade, once in a decade opportunity to be able to jump back in and help build a company and help look at products and build products that are going to make a difference there. Taking a step down from that, I feel like AI has been extremely helpful in some respects for democratizing access to being able to ask certain questions. But at the end of the day, the AI is often only as good as the context that it provides. So, one of the things I found interesting about Levelpath specifically is that they are working on a supplier system of record. This is not a unique concept, but the idea that they were building a supplier record. They are enhancing the supplier concept with a lot of metadata to show what is happening along with that. They are providing contract information to go with the supplier. They're providing sourcing events and RFPs that also go back into the supplier record. Then you start having this big corpus of information as context. So when you ask an AI question, you have a strong data record to go along with it. I feel like that is a piece that has been missing from a lot of AI vendors that either they put AI as a bolt-on right at the top or right at the front, or they try to mix AI with a bunch of areas where they can't really control the data going forward. Um,
Yeah,
so
and
yeah, so
this is what we talk about as sort of context intelligence, right? Which has become the trendy phrase to talk about how you provide language models with very specific industry stuff that the user would need. But like you said, it depends on what you have, right? You
Mhm.
can yeah, that sounds great, but you have to have that information. So you picked a vendor that you think has a bunch of that relevant information that can really make these models much more useful to the people trying to do their day-to-day jobs than if they were just using Chat GPT on the side, for example.
Right. There's so many aspects to that, but I'm going to keep it kind of high level and say that I think it's really important uh, that as we're thinking about AI, and I'm going to put on my industry analyst hat again for a second.
Woohoo! All
Yeah.
right.
That we start thinking about how to construct how AI should be used. So we talk about agentic AI a lot, and we're trying to structure what should agentic AI really mean from a practical perspective. And I think there are a lot of different categories have been built, but I like to think about them as having there being a kind of an agent basically being a trigger. It could be a button, it could be something you type, it could be a circumstance, it could be a project, and it leads to uh, looking for some context, some database context. That leads to some instructions, and then that leads to some sort of output, a document, a spreadsheet, a set of directions, something formatted and something that helps you to move forward, or it does something, it kicks something, it punches something, whatever. So you have this aspect of AI that actually goes through context and instructions to get something done. And then, so as we think about what that means from a categorical perspective, we've got these task agents, we've got some more complex, or we've got data uh, withdrawal agents with that aggregate data, or we've got these kind of more complex workflow based agents that are starting to look more like no code apps, basically, that are being tied together. And, as we're dealing with each level of complexity, we have to figure out as analysts, like, how do these fit into our line of work? How do these agents actually make our lives easier? What do we have to do to build them? Or should we really even be building them ourselves? These are all questions that are going to affect the uh, time to value and the ability to actually quickly create ROI. All sorts of things that are interesting about agentic AI. And I'm going to go back to the vendor hat now. As on the vendor side, I'm looking for analysts who are willing to talk about that future and willing to shape it rather than simply say, well, you can just put an AI layer on top of anything and that'll make it work, because that's not super interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think one of the really interesting points that I make around this is that the kind of architectures that really make LLMs relevant to the enterprise are not easy for individual customers to assemble. If
Mhm.
you have really deep teams, maybe you can do that, but the overall language models you might be tapping into are constantly evolving. The architecture around that is constantly changing. Now MCP turns out to be a potentially pretty important technology in terms of orchestrating a lot of the calls to different systems or what have you, and helping agents communicate. How is the individual customer supposed to keep up with that? And that's why I personally think that in the near term outlook of, say, 1 to 3 to 4 years, vendors like the one you're working with are going to be really important to actually achieving some level of value from this technology in enterprise context. Because I'm sorry, like workplace suites with help you write email stuff, that's not very impactful in my opinion. And neither is that there's a limit to what you can do with a chat GPT companion, not to mention all the intellectual property risks you're undertaking by interacting with those systems at work. I just don't think that's going to work for customers. I think they're going to need vendors like this. But to your point, they're also going to need analysts to help them understand the trade-offs between different approaches here, because it's not so simple to just trust a vendor, right? There's an evaluation that has to happen around all of that.
Yeah. And so going back to Levelpath, one of the reasons I joined is that the concept is about making everything easier to do. So when you talk about something like making email from AI, yeah, we can do an executive memo that describes a project, but it's just one of many, many, many ways to use AI. We also think about if you're trying to build an RFP from scratch, why should you have to do any of the busy work? You should be able to say, I just want to buy, a cryogenic machine to hold Walt Disney's head, and have the RFP AI machine do the best and do the rest, and say, well, okay, so what are the SLAs associated with the cryogenic machine? Like, there's that information is out there on the internet or in the LLMs, and we can at least do that stuff so you can focus on evaluating the vendors be whoever they may. Or being able to say, I've got a supplier. What do I need? What are my next steps for taking care of Microsoft or Adobe or whatever, so that I can keep track of them. You can literally We have an assistant where you can literally ask for next steps, and because the program knows you are in the supplier record, it knows what next steps means. And next steps would mean something different if you're in the contract side or if you're on the sourcing side. And just having that context and just saying, I want AI to help me to do what is next, instead of perhaps having AI just kind of at the top saying, I can guide you to SAP or Oracle to do the next step. That might be the right thing to do, but in and of itself, does that really help, or does that just add an extra step to what you were going to have to do anyways?
So here would be my first challenge to you would be the procurement area that you're focused on now
Yeah,
is not new to technology, right? There's all kinds of automation that's been attempted, including
yeah.
all kinds of invoice recognition systems. So are the systems falling short in some ways, and in what sense can we do even better? Like, in other words, like why, agentic AI, why generative? Like, why do these technologies help procurement people?
Yeah, I feel like there's still procurement, especially, is kind of an underserved department. It's been a soft power department for a long time, where if you're trying to get something through from a practical perspective, you probably have some sort of executive stakeholder who has to figure out budget. You might have to talk with finance. You might have to talk with accounting. You might have to talk with legal about the contract. You might have to talk about IT, about risk. You might have to get information from the supplier themselves. So you're already working with 6, 7, 8, 10 stakeholders just to get anything done, put a new supplier into place. And I feel like a lot of companies have taken the approach that the right way to go about this is just through what we call form intake, being able to standardize the forms that you fill out and then orchestrate across all of the other applications and send you to the right place, the right next step to be able to get something done. But at least from my perspective, my biased perspective, that means you still have to bounce between 6, 7, 8 different applications sometimes to get this work done. And at the end of the day, there's no centralized record to say what happened, and you can't learn from that record and make better decisions going forward. So that is the procurement gap that we think of, and that's why this solution got built.
One thing that I think about, and I'm still would need to dive deeper into this with you at some other point, but I think about like I want to be procurement is really about relationships in the end, right?
Yeah.
I want to be I can't keep track of all those things and all the things that are flying past me. I want an agent to alert me to this could be a problem here. Like you need to investigate this today. This doesn't look like a routine transaction. This needs an approval from this person. This is missing this.
Yes.
I
Mhm.
want help with that. Like I think all that kind of stuff. And also I want you to scan all these documents, see what's missing from these documents. Like I just think there's an overload in those roles. And that's where I think it's a promising area if the agent is really, like you said, been trained on my documents and my job. I'd like to see that. I think that's interesting.
It's the AI's job to figure out whether documents have gaps. It's the AI's job to enrich supplier records. That should all be AI work. We do some, I would say, basic process structure as well. So, for instance, when we show a sourcing event, we're going to show here's where you get started, here's where you do the sourcing, here's where you do the contract. We just show kind of this Domino's pizza path type experience so you don't get lost in what you're doing. I think I would say that's standard software capabilities. But on top of that, when you're talking about filling in the details and gaps that are standard or standard documentation, why not just have AI do that stuff? Like if I'm trying to look through contracts and figure out, oh, do we have an indemnification clause for AI? I should literally just be able to say which of these contracts have AI indemnification clauses, and then have AI do that part at least. There might be a next step that is beyond AI at this point and might have to go to legal. But basic things like that. So that's AI work in 2025.
Indeed. So, folks in the chat, you've been great. Just to give you official notice, we are in the wind down section. We still have a really engaged audience, so we'll continue for a bit. But
Yeah.
we are in the wind down. So, if you have any questions on any of the topics we've covered, even if it's something that we've kind of moved past a little bit, feel free to get those final comments in the next period here. I wanted to ask you about your experience in your first briefing on the other side of the table. Uh, with in this case with IDC, though we don't need to get into IDC in particular, but what was that like to kind of be on wear the other shoe?
Oh, it was actually nice. I so it was with Patrick Raymond, who was making the rounds and meeting. I'm sure us and our competitors in the space while he was in the city. But it was great to get to talk to him from this side and get to show him some of the knickknacks and doodads that we have on the software side, and being able to demo the software and just share our perspective. Because I feel like, being a month into Levelpath, I'm still in kind of a hybrid brain mode where, half of my brain is still analyst brain. Let's just be honest about it. And I'm always interested in figuring out, what is your side of the story? What are you trying to do? And frankly, what is the right way to try to get the future of analysts, future analyst coverage in a way that reflects the future of technology, not just, one vendor's perspective. Because we need to be pushed as vendors. We need analysts to keep saying, here's how you can best take advantage of all of the technological advances that are happening right now. Here's how you do not fall asleep. That is really important for us, because everybody has 1 year, 2 year roadmaps. We're trying to figure out, we're trying to go to where the puck is going to be, like Wayne Gretzky would say.
Yeah, indeed. And I think what's going to be interesting for you, and this is a whole separate conversation on the marketing side, is going to be fascinating
Mhm.
because I kind of think that people that come from the content side like you do have an advantage in marketing, because so much of marketing right now is about reaching the right audiences with the right content. And I get a lot of frustrated personally working with a lot of marketing leaders who still think it's about analytics and campaigns and all of that. And I understand all that. They want to just use AI to create the content and be done with the content. And I'm just trying to tell them that's not going to friggin' work, man.
Mhm.
So we'll see what you come up with on the content side.
Yeah. Oh, that's an
Oh, we
interesting.
got a question. Yeah, about yeah, from the other side. What should the analysts do to kick ass on a briefing with you? What are you looking for?
Yeah. So obviously, being engaged, we love showing product, and often we get into these tactical uh, discussions around product, which is fine. But I think analysts stand out more when they can ask questions that reflect where they want to drive the market over the next 6 to 12 months, where they have been running into customer questions about things that they can't do, not just from a level path perspective, or not just from an SAP perspective, but from an any vendor perspective. We like the idea of hearing questions that we might be able to put back into our product roadmap. Obviously, we also love when there's alignment between what we do and what analysts are saying. But I think honesty is honesty, and a future facing mindset that reflects customer needs are probably what really make analysts really stand out.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I would think like having confidence that analysts really understands your positions, because I always say you can't influence someone's opinions, but you can make them more informed.
Mhm.
And if someone is listening, I would think that's a big deal, because you're like, yeah, they're taking this in. Next time someone asks them about our direction or our industry, they're going to have a better handle. And I think if I were someone like you, I think one of my greatest joys would be to see people posting independently, say on LinkedIn, kind of arguing about stuff from your perspective. That's when you know you've reached someone,
Oh yeah.
when they're kind of taking it forward. This is an interesting one of will we reach the peak of expectations for AI with the next 3 months or not? I'm going to answer that first and just say I think expectations peaked, frankly, about 6 months ago, and I'll tell you why. I think at that point in the enterprise, agents were all hype, and it was a sense that they could do anything. I think to some extent that's come down to earth a bit. There are some really potent stories, but there's also a lot of studies and questions around, especially agents being able to handle more complex workloads. So I think a little bit of a slight reality check on agentic AI has come in. This is my opinion, even though we're going to hear a ton of this from the keynote stage this fall. And I would argue in the consumer domain about 6 months ago, prior to GPT-5, there was a little more exuberance around the supercharged path to AGI and the impact of reasoning models. And now reasoning models have come down to earth a little bit for a variety of reasons. And even Sam Altman has backed away from AGI and said, I don't want to talk about AGI right now. So I'm going to make the argument that we've actually stepped away from peak expectations a little bit. Not that we couldn't go up there again if something happens, but I believe we're a little bit in a slight disillusionment cycle at the moment. And I think some of the stock prices reflect that, but that's just my take.
Yeah, I'd rather call it a building opportunity rather than a
Right.
disillusionment. But like GPT-5 ended up being, it wasn't the explosive improvement that it was advertised to be. It ended up the reasoning model had some pluses and some minuses, and
Right.
that's fantastic. But we are at this moment where we're having more incremental gains in AI,
Right.
and the real challenge is in trying to operationalize what we've got rather than expecting that something brand new that is going to be Im- immensely transformative is going to be showing up in the next
And,
3 years.
and and I should probably clarify too. When I use disillusionment, I'm using it in the Gartner sense of the trough of disillusionment, where generally speaking, like that's a healthy part of the cycle. And
Yep.
so I
We
tend to
reached that,
perceive
and
it.
we're kind of yeah, we're
I
kind
tend
of
to perceive it as healthy, though I will acknowledge that sometimes with things like blockchain and metaverse, you don't emerge from that at all. I would say that in the case of AI, there will be some emergence from that so-called deflated expectations, and in fact, I don't even think we're going to see too much change there in the sense that enough customers are getting enough value from these systems that it won't feel like, oh, this totally deflated. But the I think if you watch the overall AI bubble in the market, you can see that right now is not we're not going to hit the peak of excitement anytime soon unless there's some unexpected breakthrough. And frankly, there's a lot of really interesting things to study in AI that are fascinating right now. And there's a lot of work being done on things like causal AI. If you look up active inference and the work Versus is doing on that, which is not a deep learning technology at all, but applies a lot to industrial settings. There's a lot of interesting research going on right now. And when the dots start to connect, we could reach another really exciting phase of hype. But at the moment, I think we're kind of recovering, and maybe that's okay as long as the markets don't crash.
yeah.
So,
Let's go with the deep learning and nodal agentic and
yeah,
multi-agentic work. Like, there's a lot to be done right there.
there's a ton, right? And there's really interesting things because I refer to MCP, and while it's an immature protocol, it's really interesting that competitors that never work with each other have signed on to that. And the same with Google's agent to agent framework, which is a little more advanced. But still, agents talking to each other is a new frontier that people are working on, and so there's a lot of cool stuff happening. I just want to have sober conversations, which is why I had you on, because I know that you don't get drunk on the hype, and I'm sure that will never change. So
That's the goal. That's the goal.
yeah. Well, thank you, audience, for keeping us on our toes, and I'm really glad we had a chance to kind of commemorate this career transition for you. And here's your applause for that. That was a bold and interesting decision, and it's going to be fascinating to watch how it unfolds for you. I'm sure you'll have success, and it'll be great to track you and perhaps sit on the other side of the table or whatever and catch up, and it'll be great. So,
Sure. Sounds good.
yeah, thanks a lot for joining today. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend. And by the way, next Friday, same time, Enterprise Month in Review with Brian Summer and a special guest still to be announced. So come back for more a week from today, same time. Thanks for everyone. Bye bye.